The courthouse was suffocating, packed with bodies that reeked of sweat, tobacco, and righteous indignation. Evelyn Monroe stood before Judge Cornelius Blackwood, her spine straight, despite the weight of 100 accusing stares boring into her back. The black mourning dress she'd worn for 3 weeks now hung loose on her frame, a testament to sleepless nights and meals left untouched since her father's sudden death. "Miss Monroe," Judge Blackwood's voice boomed across the courtroom, his jowls quivering with each word. "You stand accused of improper conduct and moral turpitude, having resided alone without proper male guardianship since the passing of your father, the late Judge Theodore Monroe." Evelyn's jaw clenched. 3 weeks. It had been only 3 weeks since she'd found her father slumped over his desk, his heart having given out in the night. 3 weeks of trying to settle his affairs, of keeping their modest home running, of mourning in private while the vultures circled. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands, "I have done nothing improper. I have merely been attending to my father's silence." Blackwood's gavel cracked against the wood. "A young woman of 23, unmarried, living alone, it is an affront to the moral fabric of our community. The good people of Perdition Creek will not stand for such scandal." The crowd murmured its approval. Evelyn recognized many faces. Mrs. Hartwell from the general store, who'd refused to sell her flour just yesterday. Mr. Jameson, who'd crossed the street to avoid her. Even Reverend Pike, who denied her father a proper eulogy at the funeral. "The court has reached its decision," Blackwood continued, his thin lips curling with satisfaction. "Miss Monroe, you have 2 choices. You may submit yourself to the Territorial Women's Reformatory in Yuma, where you will remain until such time as you are deemed morally rehabilitated." The blood drained from Evelyn's face. The reformatory was nothing more than a prison where women were worked to death in the desert heat, their spirits broken by cruel matrons and endless labor. Or, Blackwood leaned forward, his watery eyes gleaming, "You may choose to marry today any man present who would have you." The courtroom erupted. Men laughed. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle, but she locked them, refusing to show weakness. Her eyes swept the crowd, leering faces, mocking smiles. Not a single sympathetic glance among them. "I require your answer, Miss Monroe." This was madness, complete madness. Her father would never have allowed such a travesty of justice. But her father was gone, and with him any protection she might have had. Movement in the corner caught her eye. There, in the prisoner's dock, sat a man in chains. Unlike the others, he wasn't watching her humiliation with glee. He simply sat still as stone, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the courthouse walls. Luke Callahan. She knew him by reputation only. A gunslinger, a killer bound for the territorial prison on charges of murder. His face bore the evidence of a hard life, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, sun-weathered skin, and eyes that had seen too much death. He looked like danger itself, wrapped in human form. "Miss Monroe," Blackwood's voice grew impatient. "Your decision?" Evelyn's mind raced. The reformatory meant certain death, slow and humiliating. Marriage to any of these townsmen meant a different kind of death, a lifetime of servitude to someone who saw her as nothing more than property. But the stranger in chains, "I choose to marry," she heard herself say. The crowd quieted, eager to see which fool would claim her. Evelyn turned, her decision crystallizing with startling clarity. She pointed directly at the prisoner's dock. "I choose him, Luke Callahan." The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos. Women screamed, men shouted. Judge Blackwood's face turned purple, his gavel hammering uselessly against the pandemonium. "Order! Order!" he bellowed. "Miss Monroe, you cannot possibly. He is a condemned man." Quote, "A murderer, you said," Evelyn replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Any man present, you gave no other conditions." For the first time, Luke Callahan moved. His head turned slowly, those dark eyes meeting hers across the courtroom. No surprise registered on his face, only a mild curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. "This is preposterous." Blackwood sputtered. Marshal Dixon, surely there must be some law. Marshal Dixon, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, shrugged. You did say any man, Judge. And technically, Callahan ain't been convicted yet, just charged. Blackwood's face contorted. He'd clearly expected Evelyn to choose one of the town's eligible bachelors, men who would keep her in line, men who answered to him. This development had not been part of his plan. Mr. Callahan, Blackwood addressed the prisoner with obvious distaste, do you consent to this arrangement? Luke Callahan stood slowly, his chains clanking. He was taller than Evelyn had realized, broad-shouldered, despite his lean frame. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough as gravel. I'm not a good man, Miss Monroe. I'm not looking for a good man, Evelyn replied. I'm looking for a way out of this room that doesn't involve chains of my own. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit backed into a corner. Then I consent, he said simply. Judge Blackwood looked as if he'd swallowed a live scorpion. Very well, he ground out. Marshal Dixon, remove the prisoner's shackles. Reverend Pike, perform the ceremony, now. As the marshal unlocked Luke's chains, Evelyn made her way to the front of the courtroom. Her legs felt like water, but she kept moving. The crowd parted before her as if she carried plague. Reverend Pike's hands shook as he opened his Bible. Dearly beloved. Skip the pleasantries, Reverend, Blackwood snapped. Get on with it. The ceremony was a mockery of everything marriage should be. No flowers, no music, no joy. Just two desperate people standing before a hostile crowd, speaking vows that meant survival rather than love. Do you, Luke Callahan, take this woman? I do. Do you, Evelyn Monroe, take this man? I do. Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. Pike snapped his Bible shut. God help you both. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the stunned silence. The court grants you a 3-month trial period. You will reside at the old Stewart homestead at the edge of town. If this marriage proves unsuitable, Miss Monroe, Mrs. Callahan will be remanded to the reformatory as originally sentenced. Marshal Dixon will check on you weekly. He fixed Evelyn with a look of pure venom. You've made your choice, girl. Now live with it. As the crowd dispersed in scandalized whispers, Evelyn found herself standing beside her new husband, the stranger she'd bound herself to in front of all Perdition Creek. Up close, she saw the weariness in his eyes, the way he carried himself like a man ready for violence even without his guns. Why? He asked quietly, meant only for her ears. Because they expected me to break, she answered just as softly, and I refused to give them the satisfaction. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Fair enough. Marshal Dixon approached with a bundle of Luke's meager possessions and a set of keys. The Stewart place is 5 miles west. Follow the dry creek. It ain't much, but it's shelter. You try to run, Callahan, I'll hunt you down myself. You harm this woman, I'll hang you slow. Understood, Luke replied. They were given a wagon barely held together with rust and prayer, and a sway-backed mare that looked like a strong wind might knock her over. Evelyn retrieved her own few possessions from her father's house under the watchful eyes of neighbors who no longer pretended to be friendly. 2 carpet bags, her mother's chest, her father's books, a lifetime reduced to what could fit in the back of a dilapidated wagon. As they rode out of town, neither spoke. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the dust kicked up by the mare's hooves coated everything in a fine layer of grit. Evelyn kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back at the town that had betrayed her. The landscape changed as they traveled west. The neat buildings gave way to scattered shacks, then to open desert. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the bleached sky. Buzzards circled overhead, patient as death itself. The only sounds were the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional cry of a hawk. You should know, Luke said suddenly, his voice barely audible over the wagon's groaning. What you've gotten yourself into. I've killed men, more than they say I have. Evelyn's hands tightened on the bench, but she didn't flinch. And I've just married a stranger despite a town full of hypocrites, she said. We all make choices, Mr. Callahan. Luke, he corrected quietly. Seems foolish to stand on Sarah. And I'm Evelyn. They lapsed into silence again, but it felt different now. Less like two strangers forced together, and more like two survivors recognizing something familiar in each other. The Stewart homestead appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It was worse than Evelyn had imagined. A single-room cabin with a leaning chimney, a collapsed fence, and a well that looked like it hadn't seen water in years. The desert had already begun reclaiming it, sand drifting against the walls, thorny ocotillo growing through gaps in the floorboards. "Home, sweet home," Luke muttered, pulling the wagon to a stop. Evelyn climbed down, her muscles stiff from the ride. She surveyed their new domain with a critical eye. It would take endless work to make it livable, but it was shelter. More importantly, it was 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, 5 miles from judging eyes and wagging tongues. "I can fix the fence," Luke offered, following her gaze. "The roof looks sound enough. Chimney will need work before winter." "Assuming we last until winter," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. Luke gave her a look she couldn't quite read. "You chose this, remember? A man like me over the reformatory. Must mean you've got some fight in you. Or I'm a fool." "Maybe both," he almost smiled. "But fools sometimes survive when wise men don't." Quote, They unloaded their few possessions as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and rust. The cabin's interior was thick with dust and cobwebs, but it was solid. A cast iron stove dominated one corner, a narrow bed another, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs completed the furnishings. As darkness fell, they stood awkwardly in the small space, the reality of their situation settling like dust on their shoulders. They were married, strangers bound by law and desperation, expected to share this tiny cabin, this narrow bed, this uncertain future. "I'll sleep outside," Luke said, already moving toward the door, "until you're comfortable with the arrangements." Evelyn wanted to protest. The nights were cold, and there were scorpions and snakes, but the relief must have shown on her face because he just nodded and grabbed a blanket. "There's a revolver in my pack," he said from the doorway. "Loaded. You know how to use it?" Quote, "My father taught me." "Good. Bar the door behind me." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in a cabin that smelled of dust and abandonment. Evelyn sank onto the narrow bed, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what she'd done. In one afternoon, she'd lost everything: her home, her reputation, her freedom. She'd traded it all for this ramshackle shelter and a husband who was more stranger than savior. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds of the desert night, coyotes howling, wind whistling through the gaps in the walls, the distant hoot of an owl, she felt something unexpected. Not regret, relief. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't surrounded by people who whispered about her father's death, who questioned why a respected judge would die so suddenly, who looked at her with suspicion and false pity. Here, in this desolate place, with a man who admitted to killing, she felt paradoxically safer than she had in town. The first week passed in a blur of sweat and silence. Evelyn woke each dawn to find Luke already gone, the blanket he used folded neatly by the door. She'd hear him working, the rhythmic thud of hammer on wood, the scrape of a shovel, the occasional curse when something didn't cooperate. By the time she emerged, dressed and ready to face another day, he'd have water drawn from the well and a fire started in the stove. They moved around each other like weary animals sharing the same territory. Luke worked on the fence, the chicken coop, the gaps in the cabin walls. Evelyn threw herself into cleaning and cooking, scrubbing years of grime from the floorboards, beating dust from the thin mattress, and organizing their meager supplies. They spoke only when necessary. Pass the hammer. Water's boiling. Storm coming. The desert was teaching Evelyn lessons she'd never wanted to learn. How to conserve water when every drop had to be hauled up from a well that seemed to reach halfway to hell. How to cook over a temperamental stove that smoked at the slightest breeze. How to shake out her boots every morning, checking for scorpions that sought the comfort of darkness. On the 6th night, she burned supper again. The beans turned to charcoal while she struggled with damp firewood, and the smell of scorched food filled the cabin. She stood over the ruined pot, exhaustion and frustration finally overwhelming her careful control. "It's just beans," Luke said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "It's not just beans," she snapped, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. I can't even manage a simple meal. What use am I out here?" Luke moved past her to the stove, his movements deliberate and calm. He scraped the burned mess into a bucket, set the pot to soak, and pulled out a tin of crackers and some dried meat. "First week I was on my own, I nearly poisoned myself trying to cook prickly pear," he said, dividing the food between 2 plates. "Didn't know you had to burn the spines off first. Spent 3 days with my mouth swollen shut, living on water and rage." Despite herself, Evelyn's lips twitched. "Really? Ask any desert rat. We've all got stories of nearly dying from our own stupidity." He handed her a plate. "You're doing fine." Quote. They ate in companionable silence, and for the first time Evelyn didn't feel the need to fill it with words. The second week brought new challenges. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, turning every movement into effort. The well water grew brackish and bitter. Evelyn was struggling with an armload of firewood when she heard it, a sound that froze her blood. The dry rattle of warning. "Don't move," Luke said from behind her, voice calm but edged with steel. The rattlesnake was coiled not 3 feet away, its flat head raised, tongue flickering in and out. Evelyn's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "When I say, step back slowly," Luke instructed, moving into her peripheral vision. "Don't jerk. Just ease back. Ready? Now." She took one careful step. The snake's rattle intensified. Another step. The wood in her arms trembled. Then the snake struck. Luke's gun cleared leather faster than thought. The shot split the desert air, the snake's head vanishing in a spray of dust. Its body thrashed in death throes. Evelyn's knees buckled, the firewood scattering as she sank to the ground, shaking. Luke knelt beside her, his hands hovering near her boots. "Did it get you? Did it bite?" "No," she whispered. "I don't think so." His hands moved carefully, checking her boots and skirts for puncture marks. The touch was practical, but there was something else in it too. Care, maybe even concern. "You're all right," he said at last, sitting back on his heels. "But the desert doesn't forgive carelessness. Always check your surroundings." That night, he didn't sleep outside. Instead, he made a bedroll by the door, still giving her space but close enough to guard her if danger came. Evelyn lay awake listening to his even breathing, wondering why the sound made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. The third week brought the snake bite. Evelyn had grown careless, lulled by routine. She reached for the water bucket without looking and felt the sharp sting, 2 fangs sinking into her forearm. She jerked back, gasping, and saw the small rattler disappearing through a crack in the wall. "Luke!" Her voice cracked with panic. He burst through the door, gun drawn, taking in the scene with one look. The snake was gone, but the damage was done. "Sit down," he ordered, already pulling a knife from his belt. "This is going to hurt." Before she could protest, he sliced across the punctures and pressed his mouth to the wound, drawing out the venom, spitting it away, again and again. Evelyn gritted her teeth, trembling, her vision swimming with pain. "We need to get you to town," he said between draws. "Doc Morrison can—" "No," she gasped, clutching his arm. "I won't go back there. I won't give them the satisfaction." "Evelyn, this isn't about pride. You could die." "Then I die," she whispered fiercely, but not crawling to them. He stared at her for a long, hard moment, then went back to work, his jaw tight. When he'd done all he could, he cleaned and wrapped her arm, then sat beside the bed, watching her like a hawk. "You're a fool," he muttered. "Pot, meet kettle," she managed, her voice weak but defiant. The fever came fast. For 3 days she drifted in and out of delirium, caught between dreams and waking. She saw her father's study. Papers scattered, voices arguing in the night, his face twisted in pain. "They killed him," she mumbled through the fever. "They killed my father." "Hush," Luke's voice answered from the darkness. "You're safe. I've got you." His hand found hers, rough fingers wrapping around her trembling ones. She held on like he was the only solid thing left in the world. When the fever finally broke, she woke to find him asleep in the chair beside her, their hands still joined. His face looked younger in sleep, the harsh lines softened. He stirred as she moved, eyes opening to find her watching him. "You're awake," he said quietly, "thanks to you." He shrugged, embarrassed. "You'd have done the same." "Would I?" "Yes," he said simply. "You chose a condemned man over safety. You don't scare easy." Quote, when she smiled faintly, he looked away, muttering something about broth and standing up too fast, pretending he wasn't shaken by her gratitude, or by how close he'd come to losing her. By the end of the week, she was strong enough to help around the cabin again. They repaired the wall where the snake had entered, set traps, and worked side by side without needing many words. At sunset one evening, Luke pulled a battered harmonica from his pocket. The tune he played was rough, but haunting, a melody of loss and longing that seemed to fill the empty spaces between them. "My wife loved music," he said softly when the last note faded. Evelyn looked up sharply. He'd never mentioned her before. "Sarah," he said, voice heavy with memory. "She used to sing while she worked, had a voice like honey and smoke." "What happened?" Evelyn asked gently. His eyes went distant. "Raiders. While I was driving cattle south, I came home to ashes, found them later, the ones who did it, killed them all." Evelyn's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He gave a small, bitter smile. "After that, killing was all I knew, easier than living with ghosts." "Maybe that's why you're still here," she said, "to learn again." He looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, "You talk in your sleep too. About your father." Her hands stilled on the sewing she'd been pretending to focus on. "He didn't just die, Luke. He was healthy, until he wasn't. I heard voices that night. Papers went missing. I think Judge Blackwood had him killed." Luke's eyes hardened. "You think?" Quote, "I know it in my bones." She stood, pacing. "Father was investigating something. Land deeds, the railway expansion. Blackwood wanted him silenced. And now I'm the one they tried to bury alive." Luke leaned back, watching her. "So the judge got rid of your father and tried to break you next." Evelyn met his gaze. He failed. Lightning flickered on the horizon, thunder rolling closer. A storm was brewing, thick with dust and tension. When the first drops hit the roof, Luke rose to check for leaks, but neither of them moved far from each other. The air between them was heavy, charged. Evelyn's heart pounded in rhythm with the rain. "Evelyn," Luke said, his voice low and rough. "I'm not her," she whispered. "I know." He stepped closer. She tilted her face up to him. "Then stop treating me like a ghost." He hesitated, then reached for her, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing her jaw. She leaned into the touch before she could think better of it. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle. It was the desperate meeting of two people who'd been half dead too long. The storm outside roared, wind and rain pounding against the cabin, but neither of them noticed. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, Luke took a step back, his chest rising and falling. "We can't," he said hoarsely. "I can't. I'm not asking for forever," she said quietly. "Just for now." He searched her face, then pulled her close again, resting his forehead against hers. "You're going to be the death of me, woman." "Better than a bullet," she murmured, and for the first time since that courthouse, he laughed. They didn't make love that night, not yet. Instead, they sat side by side on the narrow bed, talking quietly as the storm spent itself outside. Luke told her about the things he missed, the smell of wet sage, the sound of his son's laughter. Evelyn told him about her mother's garden, about the day she decided she'd rather die free than live obedient. When dawn came, the world was washed clean. The rain had passed, leaving the air cool and sharp. Luke stood at the doorway, watching the sunrise. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked softly from behind him. "Now," he said, turning to meet her eyes, "we survive." She stepped closer until their shoulders brushed. "Together?" He nodded once. "Together." The wind swept through the valley, carrying the smell of creosote and something new, hope. They didn't know it yet, But this was only the beginning. The judge, the bounty, the ghosts of the past, everything would come for them soon enough. But for that single morning, under the wide Arizona sky, two broken souls stood side by side and decided to fight the world together. And that, in the wild heart of the West, was the most dangerous promise of all.